Good evening. Tonight we descend into a story that will challenge everything you think you know about SARS. What follows is a journey through fear, survival, devastation, and the fragile line between life and death. What rises next is not a tale born in comfort, but in the suffocating heat of overcrowded wards, where air hung heavy with dread, and the only sound was the broken rhythm of failing lungs. In those months of 2003, humanity confronted an enemy so small it remained invisible to every trembling hand that tried to contain it, yet so powerful it threatened to shatter the fragile illusions of modern medicine. A virus moved through cities as if carried by the breath of the terrified, slipping through crowded elevators, dim hospital corridors, and the unguarded spaces between one heartbeat and the next. And everywhere it traveled, the world felt smaller, darker, and more uncertain. In the heart of overwhelmed hospitals, exhaustion stained the faces of workers who had long forgotten the meaning of rest. Masks clung to their skin like a second layer of fear. Their eyes, fogged from fatigue and dread, stared into the hollow stillness of isolation rooms. Behind sealed doors, patients gasped for breath that no longer belonged to them, each inhale a battle, each exhale an unanswered plea. It was a place where time no longer moved in hours, but in the rise and fall of chests that struggled against the tightening grip of pneumonia. Machines hummed without promise, and monitors flickered like weary guardians watching lives slip further away. The world beyond those walls sensed the growing shadow long before it understood its shape. Streets emptied not by force but by instinct, an ancient recoil from the unseen. People avoided the warmth of each other's presence, flinching from the possibility that death could hide in a single breath. Families became islands, separated by fear of what they might carry home. The air itself felt sharpened, charged with the memory of those who had already fallen. In crowded emergency rooms, trembling hands moved across paper charts that no longer offered clarity. The symptoms appeared suddenly, as if ambushing even the most experienced healers: a fever that rose like a warning flame, aches that settled deep into bone, a cough that grew heavier, deeper, more consuming. And then came the moment every worker feared: the sudden spiral into respiratory failure, as though the virus waited for the perfect moment to reveal its true power. Patients who had walked into hospitals under their own strength collapsed under the weight of a storm swelling inside their lungs. The medical staff, wrapped in layers of protective gear, stood at the border between the living and the dying. Every breath they took was a negotiation with possibility. They fought not only the virus, but also the suffocating knowledge that every decision, every touch, every moment spent inside those rooms could determine both their patient's fate and their own. Fear moved with them, threading itself through every gesture, every hesitation, every unspoken thought of "will I be next?" The virus cared nothing for devotion, skill, or sacrifice. It moved through their ranks with quiet precision. As days turned into weeks, hospitals that once symbolized hope began to resemble battlegrounds. Beds multiplied in hallways, blankets, oxygen tanks, and weary bodies filled every corner. The line between safety and exposure blurred until it vanished completely. And still the numbers grew. One infection became 5 became 20, and then the spread slipped beyond the walls of the hospital, gathering momentum in densely populated neighborhoods, markets, and transports. The virus traveled with the simplicity of a shared elevator button, a fleeting cough, a momentary lapse in caution. By the time the world fully grasped what was happening, it had already outrun containment. The fear that gripped the global population was not the theatrical kind, but the slow, creeping dread that sinks into the joints and refuses to leave. It whispered in the mind during sleepless nights, reminding millions that humanity's greatest vulnerability lies not in strength, but in the assumption of safety. People waited behind closed doors, listening to distant sirens and wondering which breath they had taken was the wrong one. Entire neighborhoods fell silent, as though the world itself held its breath. Within laboratories, scientists stared into microscopes and computer screens, searching for patterns in the genetic code that could explain how a virus so small could bring nations to their knees. Their work unfolded under pressure that felt almost gravitational. Every discovery was a race against time, every breakthrough a fragile light in an expanding darkness. The virus offered no mercy, no hesitation. It moved with the precision of something that had been preparing for this moment long before humans understood its existence. In the darkest corners of these institutions, the question echoed again and again. How could something so insignificant wield such devastating power? The answer lay not only in biology, but in the interconnected world. Humanity had created one where borders were porous, cities were crowded, and a single spark could ignite a global blaze. SARS did not need armies or weapons, it needed only opportunity. The fear spread faster than the virus, threading through airports, markets, classrooms, and households. Travelers carried more than luggage, they carried uncertainty. People watched the news with clenched hands, searching for reassurance that never arrived. Every cough in a crowded room felt like a harbinger, every fever a threat. The invisible enemy had outmaneuvered the visible world. By the time the global alarm was raised, the outbreak had already carved its path through the rhythms of daily life. Entire nations stood on the edge of collapse as their healthcare systems strained under the weight of the unknown. The air grew thick with questions that no one could answer. The virus moved onward, indifferent to borders, cultures, hopes, or fears. It existed only to spread, replicate, and survive. And in the exhaustion of those early months, as bodies weakened and systems failed, the world found itself staring into a truth it had long ignored, that the smallest forms of life often wield the greatest power. These microscopic agents did not negotiate, they did not threaten, they simply acted. And in their wake, the world staggered. The nightmarish scenes of overwhelmed hospitals, the cries of families separated by necessity, the fogged visors of workers who no longer knew the meaning of rest, all of it pointed toward a single, unavoidable question. Where did this nightmare begin? To understand the terror that erupted in 2003, we must journey backward far beyond the fluorescent lights of modern hospitals, beyond the noise of global headlines, beyond even the first recorded case in Guangdong. Every epidemic has a lineage, a shadowed ancestry carved through time. SARS was no exception. Its origins stretch into the wild architecture of ecosystems, into the ancient pact between humans and the creatures they inhabit the world with, and into the silent evolutionary games played by viruses long before humanity gave them names. Long before the outbreak that shook the world high above the forest floors of southern China, colonies of bats carved their lives in the open air. In these towering caverns of darkness, packed wing to wing in churning living currents, the earliest ancestors of SARS-CoV slept, fed, and traded microbes in a ceaseless ancient exchange. Within their bodies, coronaviruses drifted through generations like whispered secrets, shifting, recombining, and evolving. These animals were reservoirs, not by intention, but by nature keepers of viral diversity shaped by millions of years of cohabitation with microscopic agents that rarely harmed them. In the fevered imagination of past civilizations, bats were the embodiments of omens, shadows, or portents. They were creatures that dwelled between the worlds of earth and sky, seen only at the edges of light. Yet their true significance lay not in myth, but in biology. Their immune systems, honed by evolutionary pressures, permitted viruses to exist within them without catastrophe. They carried in their bodies archives of viral potential, each strand woven into a tapestry of possibilities, waiting for a bridge into new hosts. That bridge would come from human expansion, the intrusion of markets, farms, and cities into the last wild refuges. As the borders between wilderness and civilization blurred, contact zones emerged where species that had spent millennia apart were suddenly forced together. And in these liminal spaces, viruses found pathways to transcend their original homes. In the bustling markets of Guangdong, where animals from distant ecosystems were gathered in dense proximity, the ancient boundaries that had once kept viruses confined dissolved completely. Creatures that would never meet in the wild were stacked in cages and sold in a chaotic symphony of movement, noise, and breath. Here, civet cats, small nocturnal mammals with keen senses, unwittingly became intermediaries. They acted as the bridge between bat reservoirs and human susceptibility. Within these markets, viral particles passed silently from species to species, seeking any host whose cells would provide a fertile environment. The transfer was not dramatic, It was incremental, microscopic, almost poetic in its simplicity. A virus leaped from the warm breath of a bat to the fur of a civet, drifting through mucous membranes and lung tissue, until through chance or inevitability it adapted to human biology. And in that moment a spark was lit. But SARS's story stretches even deeper into history, reaching into the chronicles of ancient plagues that once swept across Asia. In medical texts from early dynasties, healers describe mysterious fevers that stole breath and weakened the body with startling speed. These accounts, recorded in ink on fragile scrolls, whisper of outbreaks marked by coughing fits, sudden chills, and suffocating tightness in the chest. Though the languages differ and the centuries have passed, the symptoms echo patterns familiar to modern virology. Some ancient physicians believed such illnesses were carried by malevolent winds, birthed from imbalance or divine displeasure. Others attributed them to corrupted air rising from the earth. Still others spoke of invisible agents, concepts primitive and unrefined, yet hauntingly close to the truth. They did not know the word virus, but they sensed the existence of something hidden, something that moved between bodies with an intelligence not its own. Across deserts, mountains, and empires, respiratory plagues emerged repeatedly, seeding devastation and shaping cultures. While history cannot confirm that these outbreaks were early coronaviruses, the similarities speak of a lineage of pathogens that have long watched humanity from the edges of perception. The viruses that evolved into SARS did not appear suddenly. They matured over eras, adapting to shifting ecologies, surviving natural bottlenecks, and learning through the slow logic of evolution how to exploit the vulnerabilities of human biology. The natural world fostered these viral lineages in silence. In the shadow of cliffs and the canopy of forests, pathogens circulated within animal communities unnoticed, unmeasured, and unchallenged. Each mutation, each recombination event was a step toward potential emergence. Coronaviruses, with their capacity for genetic flexibility, drifted in countless variations, most harmless, some benignly persistent, others carrying within them the seeds of catastrophe. As humans expanded agriculture, carved cities, and intensified trade, they unknowingly offered these viruses new opportunities. Livestock farms provided dense populations with limited genetic diversity, ideal breeding grounds for viral amplification. Markets provided direct human-animal interaction. Transportation networks extended the reach of any pathogen that found an efficient route into the human population. In this interconnected world, the transition from animal reservoir to human host became less a rare accident and more an expected probability. The emergence of SARS was not merely a biological event, it was an ecological consequence, a product of the increasingly narrow gap between human ambition and natural resilience. When bat populations were displaced by deforestation or forced into closer proximity with farm animals, the viral reservoirs shifted too. The delicate balance that had existed for thousands of years fractured, creating new interfaces where viral spillover could occur with alarming ease. Equally important are the silent evolutionary mechanics that shaped SARS-CoV into what it became. Its spike protein, an intricately crafted biological key, was honed by genetic chance to fit receptors on human cells. With each mutation, its ability to attach, enter, and replicate within human tissue improved. What began as a virus adapted to bats found itself suddenly equipped to thrive in an entirely different organism. Once inside human lungs, it used familiar strategies perfected in the bodies of its original hosts, evading early immune responses, replicating aggressively, and spreading through respiratory droplets expelled in casual speech, breath, or cough. But the story of SARS's origins is not only molecular or ecological, it is also cultural, shaped by economic demands, traditional practices, and the vast machinery of global commerce. In regions where wildlife consumption had deep historical roots, markets functioned not merely as sources of food, but as expressions of identity and heritage. Yet in these dense spaces, live animals became involuntary participants in an ancient viral exchange. As SARS began its quiet migration toward humanity, the world remained unaware. The virus likely passed through several intermediate hosts, testing the boundaries of its compatibility with human physiology. Each encounter offered new genetic combinations. Each replication cycle introduced variations that would determine whether it remained trapped in the animal world or stepped across the threshold into ours. And when the final mutation aligned, the virus slipped into a human host, perhaps a trader, a handler, a market customer, someone who felt only the ordinary weight of daily life, unaware that they now carried within them a biological engine capable of igniting an epidemic. This moment, unseen and unrecorded, marked the true beginning of SARS as a human disease. Long before the world heard the first reports, long before the alarm sounded, long before borders closed and fear spread, the virus had already begun mapping its path. It moved with a patient evolutionary logic, exploring new cellular landscapes, adapting to human immune defenses, searching for pathways of transmission that would allow it to leap from one body to another. Yet even this pivotal moment belongs to a broader tapestry of history. For centuries, respiratory diseases have haunted human civilization. Whether in crowded ancient capitals or remote settlements, pathogens exploited the universal vulnerability of breath. The same breath that sustains life also provides a doorway through which microscopic invaders enter and reshape destinies. SARS was another chapter in this ancient relationship between humanity and the unseen. The early accounts of unfamiliar fevers in rural China in the late 20th century hinted that something was stirring long before the first confirmed outbreak. Small clusters of respiratory illness dismissed as seasonal or routine may have been early evolutionary experiments, viral strains testing their compatibility with human hosts. Whether these were direct precursors or unrelated outbreaks is lost to time. But the pattern is unmistakable. The boundaries between species were thinning, and the viral world was preparing to cross. Thus, the origin of SARS is not a singular event, but an accumulation of forces: ecological disruption, wildlife trade, evolutionary mutation, human expansion, cultural tradition, and global connectivity. Each acted as a strand in a larger web that gradually tightened until a single spillover event caused it to snap. In that moment, the virus that had evolved in the hidden reservoirs of bats found its way into the bloodstream of humanity, and nothing would ever be the same again. SARS emerged not from malice or intention, but from the relentless logic of nature, an illustration of life's complexity at scales too small for the naked eye to witness. Its arrival was a reminder that the world's most formidable threats often arise not with noise, but with silence, not with force, but with opportunity, not with warning, but with inevitability. And so, as the virus took root in its first human host, the seeds of a global crisis were sown. What followed would unfold with terrifying speed, as if nature itself had decided to test the resilience of modern civilization. The ancient origins were complete, the spark had ignited, and now the virus was ready to rise. The rise of SARS was not a sudden explosion, but a quiet ignition, a series of small, almost invisible movements that began deep within the bustling heart of Guangdong. In late 2002, as winter settled over southern China, the first embers of the coming storm flickered in local clinics. Patients arrived with fevers that refused to break, with coughs that burrowed deep into the lungs, with fatigue that hollowed them from the inside. At first, these cases blended seamlessly into the landscape of seasonal illness. Doctors saw familiar symptoms, common patterns, ordinary suffering until they looked closer. Something was different. The fevers rose too quickly, the coughs intensified too sharply, the lungs filled too suddenly, as though an unseen hand tightened around them without warning. And the illness did not move through households alone. It leapt between strangers with startling efficiency. Clusters formed where none should have existed: families, neighbors, workers, all struck by the same violent decline. Within the densely populated communities of Guangdong, the virus found the perfect stage. Streets thrummed with life, markets overflowed with movement and noise. Families lived close, breathed the same air, shared the same spaces. Here, SARS found opportunity. It passed quietly between commuters on crowded buses, between workers sharing lunch, between vendors calling to customers over open stalls. It circulated through the geometry of daily life, carried on breaths so ordinary that no one could trace the moment of transmission. Local physicians sensed the threat before the outside world took notice. They confronted an illness that defied expectations, one that refused to respond to standard treatments. As the weeks passed, death began casting its shadow over their efforts. Patients who seemed stable suddenly spiraled, their lungs overwhelmed by inflammation. Panic simmered beneath the surface, unspoken yet palpable. Something new was testing the boundaries of human understanding. In the early days, information moved more slowly than the virus. Hospitals reported unusual cases, officials weighed the implications, but hesitation allowed SARS to advance. Silence, whether born from uncertainty or caution, gave the virus a head start that would prove catastrophic. The outbreak expanded quietly, slipping through the tightly woven fabric of daily life. And then, with a single journey, the virus escaped its birthplace. In February 2003, a doctor from Guangdong traveled to Hong Kong, carrying within him the infection that had already begun reshaping his homeland. Unaware of the invisible burden he held, he checked into the Metropole Hotel. There, in the quiet hallways of the 9th floor, SARS found its moment. The virus radiated outward through the simple mechanics of human presence, contaminated air-shared surfaces, brief encounters, passing breaths. The Metropole became a crucible of contagion. Guests who lingered in those hallways carried the virus with them as they left the building, boarding planes and taxis, returning to their homes across continents. In that single convergence of chance and travel, SARS seized global reach. It did not require malice or intention, it needed only movement. From Hong Kong, the virus traveled outward with chilling precision. A businessman carried it to Hanoi. A traveler brought it to Singapore. A flight transported it to Toronto. In cities separated by thousands of miles, the first sparks of a global outbreak were lit almost simultaneously. The world, unaware of the biological storm gathering above it, continued moving in the rhythms of modern life, crowded trains, busy markets, bustling airports. And through these channels, SARS slipped effortlessly, moving faster than the warnings that tried to follow it. In Toronto, the virus infiltrated a family returning from Hong Kong, passing quietly between relatives who had no reason to fear their own closeness. The illness quickly multiplied within households and hospitals, weaving itself into the fabric of a city unprepared for its arrival. Healthcare workers found themselves facing an enemy they could not see and barely understood. Their protective gear, their training, their procedures, none offered complete defense against the relentless nature of this new pathogen. Singapore felt the tremors soon after. The illness entered through international travelers and spread through corridors of hospitals where staff worked tirelessly to halt the growing threat. Despite their efforts, SARS leaped between wards, patients, and nurses with a cunning efficiency that defied containment. The virus exploited uncertainty, thriving in the chaos of early response. In Hanoi, the situation escalated with alarming speed. Doctors confronted a disease unlike any they had encountered before. It attacked the lungs with a ferocity that defied medical expectations, overwhelming even the most experienced staff. The virus moved rapidly through hospital workers who had dedicated their lives to healing. Instead, they found themselves becoming casualties of the very threat they were fighting. Hong Kong, already burdened by the original Metropole cluster, watched as SARS erupted within residential complexes. In Amoy Gardens, the outbreak spread through the building with terrifying speed. Residents awakened to the reality that the enemy had already infiltrated their homes, moving through air currents and communal spaces. Fear rooted itself deeply. Families isolated themselves behind closed doors, whispering through masks and hoping the virus would pass them by. As global infections multiplied, the world began to understand that SARS was not a localized threat. It was a test of a civilization built on speed, movement, and interconnectedness. The very systems that defined modern life, international travel, urban density, global trade, became conduits for catastrophe. Borders, once symbols of sovereignty, faltered against the movement of a pathogen that recognized none of them. Governments scrambled to respond. Airports implemented temperature screenings. Hospitals erected isolation wards. Cities urged residents to avoid travel, avoid crowds, avoid each other. Fear surged across continents faster than official statements could calm it. Schools closed, events were cancelled, streets emptied. The world felt itself contracting, collapsing inward under the weight of impending uncertainty. Yet even as fear spread, confusion dominated. Scientists struggled to identify the virus. Was it bacterial, viral, new or mutated? Each theory carried implications that shifted daily. Laboratories raced to analyze samples, and each hour of delay gave the virus another foothold. Missteps, disagreements, and cautious revisions added to the growing unease. The virus exploited every weakness. Infected individuals, unaware of their status during the incubation period, traveled across cities, dined with family-visited doctors, and continued daily life. By the time symptoms appeared, entire webs of transmission had already been woven. Tracing those invisible threads became a monumental challenge, one the world was unprepared to handle. Hospitals, the traditional bulwarks against disease, became amplifiers. The close proximity of patients, the urgency of emergency care, and the unavoidable interactions between staff and the sick created a perfect environment for SARS to flourish. Healthcare workers, nurses, doctors, paramedics became some of the most vulnerable victims. Their exposure was constant, their duties unrelenting. They were the first line of defense and often the first to fall. As the virus spread across nations, geopolitical tensions surfaced. Countries questioned each other's transparency. Accusations of delayed reporting and withheld information rippled through diplomatic channels. Trust eroded where cooperation was most needed. The world found itself engulfed not only in a biological crisis, but in a political one. The World Health Organization struggled to coordinate a response amid growing uncertainty. Each nation faced unique challenges: population density, healthcare capacity, public behavior, and each grappled with decisions that bore enormous consequences. To close borders or keep them open, to quarantine entire buildings or select only the sick, to mandate masks or refrain until evidence demanded it. In this labyrinth of unknowns, SARS moved unchallenged. News media broadcast images of masked cities, overwhelmed hospitals, and exhausted workers. The psychological impact was profound. People feared strangers, feared travel, feared the invisible air around them. Social rituals fractured. Human connection became a threat. The virus had achieved what no political force had managed: it reshaped the daily behavior of millions. Superspreading events emerged as defining features of the outbreak. A single individual, infected but unaware, had the potential to ignite dozens of new cases. These events created surges that destabilized entire regions, revealing how unpredictable and explosive the virus could be. They demonstrated that SARS did not spread evenly. It erupted in bursts, targeting some spaces with devastating efficiency, while sparing others inexplicably. With each passing day, the virus pressed deeper into global consciousness. It challenged scientific certainty, political confidence, and social cohesion. It exposed vulnerabilities in healthcare systems once considered robust. It revealed how quickly a modern city could descend into emergency. And it reminded the world that pathogens, despite being microscopic, wield the power to reshape civilization. As SARS tore through communities, the question was no longer whether it could be contained. The new question was whether containment would come too late. By the early months of 2003, the virus had established footholds across multiple continents. International efforts grew more desperate, research intensified, quarantines expanded, entire buildings were sealed, lives were disrupted, economies faltered. And through it all, SARS continued to move with quiet determination, indifferent to the human turmoil surrounding it. The global rise of SARS was not just a medical event, it was a mirror held up to humanity. It revealed the fragility of interconnected systems, the dangers of hesitation, and the price of underestimating nature's capacity to exploit human complexity. The world had taken its first steps into a crisis unlike anything it had faced in decades. And as nations scrambled to respond, SARS pressed forward, ushering humanity into an era defined not by what had been lost, but by what remained uncertain. The rise was complete. The terror was only beginning. As SARS tightened its grip around the world, an age of terror began to unfold, an era defined not by the noise of war or the clash of armies, but by the suffocating stillness that comes when humanity confronts something too small to see and too powerful to ignore. The virus drifted through nations like a dark, unrelenting tide, reshaping daily life with invisible hands. And in that atmosphere of dread, fear became a second contagion, spreading through societies even faster than the pathogen itself. In city after city, death shadows deepened. Hospitals' overflowed hallways turned into makeshift wards, and the exhausted hands of workers trembled beneath layers of protective gear. Every new patient carried the potential to ignite another chain of despair. The global death toll rose with cold indifference, each number representing a life consumed by lungs tightening under the weight of uncontrolled inflammation. Within hospital walls, nothing resembled normalcy. Breathing became a measure of time, coughing became a warning, isolation became an act of mercy. Healthcare workers stood at the front line of this terror. They were hailed as shields, yet they were never given true protection. Each shift pulled them deeper into contact with an enemy that clung to the surface of their gowns, their gloves, their faces, their breath. The virus infiltrated their bodies with the same ruthless efficiency it used against the public. Many fell ill, many died. Their sacrifice carved invisible scars into the collective memory of every city touched by the outbreak. For those outside the medical system, psychological paralysis became a daily companion. Fear infiltrated grocery lines, elevators, and living rooms. People scrutinized every cough, every shiver, every bead of sweat. Families avoided one another. Handshakes became relics. The warm rituals of human closeness, shared meals, laughter in crowded rooms, the simple comfort of presence were replaced by a haunting distance. The world moved through a fog of suspicion. As weeks turned into months, entire cities began to resemble hollow shells. Streets emptied, restaurants shuttered, and workplaces fell silent. Schools locked their doors, leaving classrooms suspended in eerie stillness. Parents whispered instructions through masks. Children stared through windows at a world that felt altered beyond recognition. The curiosity of youth collided with the fear of an uncertain future. Public fear morphed into something more corrosive: blame. In every culture touched by SARS, rumors festered in the cracks of uncertainty. Some accused foreigners, others blamed governments. Some pointed toward wildlife markets, others whispered about laboratories. Superstition flourished where information failed. Masks became symbols of responsibility in some nations and symbols of panic in others. Mistrust spread through neighborhoods and nations alike. Governments, overwhelmed by unfolding chaos, lurched between decisive action and paralyzing hesitation. Some imposed drastic quarantines, sealing off entire neighborhoods, hotels, or apartment blocks. Residents were confined to their homes under watchful eyes. Food was delivered through doorways and left without human contact. The atmosphere thickened with quiet resentment and quiet acceptance, bound together by the grim understanding that survival required sacrifice. Other nations faltered, denying the severity of the crisis until it was too late. Their reluctance allowed the virus to spread unchallenged, turning early misjudgments into catastrophic consequences. Disorganized responses sowed confusion among citizens who did not know whom to trust or how to protect themselves. Mixed messages fractured already fragile public confidence. Internationally, borders hardened with unprecedented force. Airports became labyrinths of screenings and barriers. Travelers faced temperature checks, interrogations, and quarantines that stretched for weeks. Nations banned flights, closed ports, and shut off routes that had once symbolized global unity. The world's interconnected systems, celebrated for decades as triumphs of modernity, were suddenly perceived as vulnerabilities to be sealed. Families carried the emotional weight of separation. In the name of safety, patients were isolated from loved ones. They lay in sterile rooms surrounded by machines instead of comforting hands. Some passed away without hearing familiar voices, without feeling a final embrace. Those who remained outside were left with unanswered questions and unresolved grief. Funerals were held quietly, stripped of tradition, attended by a few masked figures who stood far apart. For survivors, recovery did not bring relief. Many grappled with lingering weakness, damaged lungs, and the psychological trauma of confronting death so closely. The disease marked not only their bodies, but their memories, shaping how they viewed the fragility of existence. Media coverage, relentless and unshielded, amplified the terror. Images of masked cities, frantic doctors, sealed buildings, and rising death counts became daily companions. The world consumed the unfolding tragedy with equal parts horror and helplessness. News anchors spoke with tightened voices. Experts debated live while global audiences clung to their words. The sense of vulnerability became universal. Meanwhile, in laboratories across continents, tension simmered. The scientific community desperately sought answers: transmission routes, incubation periods, genetic sequencing, treatment strategies, but the virus resisted their efforts with complexity and unpredictability. Initial misinterpretations led to flawed assumptions. Conflicting theories circulated. Each adjustment to official guidelines reminded the public of how little was known. This shifting ground eroded trust not only in governments but in science itself. SARS did not merely infect bodies, it infected systems. Hospitals faltered under pressure, airlines collapsed under travel bans. Economies convulsed as industries rooted in human presence fell to a halt. Tourism vanished, manufacturing slowed, trade lines fractured. In some regions, the fear of infection outweighed the fear of financial ruin. In others, economic desperation overshadowed caution. Communities most vulnerable suffered the greatest. Migrant workers were left without income or support. Rural clinics lacked capacity to treat the severely ill. Urban poor struggled to obtain even the most basic protective measures. Inequality deepened as the virus exposed fractures long ignored by policymakers. And beneath all these layers of chaos, the virus continued its silent campaign, moving from host to host with unwavering purpose. It did not need strategy, it did not need intelligence. Its only requirement was human proximity, and humanity unknowingly provided it. As the world confronted its terror, the virus exploited every opportunity. A shared apartment elevator, a hospital corridor, a bus ride, a simple breath in a crowded room. Infection passed not through dramatic encounters, but through mundane rituals of daily life. This was the most chilling revelation that destruction required nothing extraordinary. It required only the ordinary. Political missteps intensified the despair. Delayed warnings, inconsistent messaging, and censorship in the early stages of the outbreak sowed seeds of doubt that would haunt the global response. Some nations downplayed the threat to preserve economic stability. Others withheld information to avoid scrutiny. These failures granted SARS the time it needed to entrench itself and spread. In the midst of such turmoil, some leaders resorted to harsh measures. Entire hospitals were sealed. Streets were sanitized with chemical sprays. People were forcibly quarantined in government facilities. These actions, though controversial, reflected the desperation of a world wrestling with a threat it did not fully understand. Societies entered a kind of suspended animation. Anyone could be a carrier, anyone could be a victim, anyone could be the next link in an expanding chain of tragedy. Under this unrelenting pressure, fear hardened into a collective psychology that left few untouched. Anxiety took root at breakfast tables, in office cubicles, left abandoned in homes where families sat apart, even within the same room. The age of terror was not defined by momentary panic, but by sustained dread. Each day brought new infections, new warnings, new restrictions, new losses. The virus carved its place in global memory by forcing humanity to confront its most vulnerable truth, that the systems believed to protect civilization could crumble in the presence of something smaller than a grain of dust. And through this chaos, one question echoed across continents. How could a single virus bring the world so close to paralysis? The terror surged, the fear deepened, and the crisis entered its most perilous phase. Humanity now faced not only the destruction unfolding before its eyes, but the mystery of the enemy orchestrating it. To understand the devastation SARS unleashed, we must turn inward into the microscopic battlefield where life and death negotiate their terms in silence. The virus that brought the world trembling to its knees was not a monster of scale or spectacle. It was a cluster of genetic instructions, a strand of RNA wrapped in protein and crowned with spikes that glimmered like cold biological weapons, under the scrutiny of science. Yet within this unassuming structure lay the blueprint for chaos, a design optimized by evolution to infiltrate, replicate, and survive at humanity's expense. SARS-CoV belonged to the coronavirus family, a lineage of pathogens shaped by millennia inside the bodies of animals. Under a microscope, its form resembled a dark orb surrounded by a halo of protruding spike structures that gave the coronavirus its regal name, but carried a far more sinister function. These spikes were keys crafted by mutation and natural selection to unlock the defenses of living cells. Each one was a molecular hook capable of binding to receptors found deep within human airways, exploiting a vulnerability so fundamental that even the most advanced medical defenses struggled to block it. The process of infection began with a single encounter, one breath, one moment, one unguarded inhale. Viral particles drifted into the respiratory tract, settling onto the moist surfaces of nasal passages, throats, or lungs. There, the virus sought out AC2 receptors, microscopic gateways embedded in the membranes of human cells. When the spike protein connected with these receptors, a silent negotiation occurred. The cell, unaware it was allowing an enemy inside, opened its doors. Once inside, the virus dismantled the rules of the host cell and erected its own. It released its RNA, a slender, vulnerable thread that carried all the information necessary to create thousands of copies of itself. The cell, now hijacked, redirected its machinery toward a single purpose, producing viral components. Instead of maintaining the body, it became a factory for its own destruction. The early stages of replication were quiet. There was no immediate pain, no dramatic sign of invasion. The virus multiplied in the shadows, assembling new particles that would soon burst forth, ready to claim neighboring cells. Through this repetition, entry takeover, replication release, the infection expanded like a storm front rolling through the lungs. The first symptoms emerged when the immune system noticed the intrusion. Fever rose like a beacon of distress as the body attempted to burn away the invader. Coughs erupted as inflammation irritated the airways. Fatigue seeped into muscles and bones as energy diverted to defense. The immune response, though essential, was only the beginning of the body's struggle, and for many, it became the greatest threat of all. SARS triggered an immune reaction both fierce and chaotic. In some patients, the defense system unleashed a torrent of signaling molecules known as cytokines. These molecules normally guided the body's armies toward infected cells, but in SARS, the response sometimes spiraled out of control. A cytokine storm surged through the bloodstream, flooding tissues with inflammatory signals that caused more harm than the virus itself. The lungs, delicate and intricately structured, bore the brunt of this assault. Fluid seeped into the alveoli, the tiny sacs responsible for oxygen exchange, turning them into heavy, unyielding chambers that suffocated rather than sustained. Breathing, once automatic and effortless, became a desperate labor. Patients described the sensation as drowning in air, a paradox of suffocation within the very medium meant to preserve life. The virus damaged the cells lining the lungs, stripping away their ability to keep fluids at bay. Meanwhile, the immune system, blinded by the urgency of its own attack, destroyed infected cells so violently that entire sections of lung tissue collapsed. The pneumonia that followed was not a simple infection, but a cascade of failures. Oxygen levels plummeted, heart rate soared, organs strained under the systemic stress. In severe cases, patients slipped into acute respiratory distress syndrome, a state where the lungs could no longer sustain the body's most basic needs. Ventilators, though vital, offered only partial relief. They pushed air into lungs that were no longer able to receive it freely. Transmission of SARS occurred with equal subtlety and brutality. The virus traveled through droplets expelled during coughing, speaking, or even breathing. These droplets carried viable viral particles capable of surviving on surfaces for hours, waiting for unwitting hands to bring them to new hosts. In crowded environments, one infected individual could turn an entire room into a network of future cases. Superspreading events emerged not because the virus behaved differently in certain people, but because human environments, tight quarters, poor ventilation, shared surfaces gave the pathogen opportunities to leap across multiple hosts in rapid succession. The incubation period added another layer of danger. For several days after infection, individuals carried the virus without symptoms. They walked through public spaces, touched doors, sat in taxis, conversed with family members, all while shedding viral particles that would seed illness in those around them. This invisible window of contagiousness made containment extraordinarily difficult. By the time symptoms appeared, entire chains of transmission had already formed. Mortality varied by age and health, but SARS carried a severity that defied complacency. It killed roughly 10% of those infected, a staggering figure for a respiratory virus. Among elderly patients, the mortality rate soared higher. Healthcare workers, due to constant exposure, faced disproportionate risk. The virus exploited every moment of contact, every lapse in protective barriers, every breath shared between caregiver and patient. At the microscopic level, SARS employed a strategy that balanced aggression with efficiency. It spread quickly enough to infect others before the host became incapacitated, yet severely enough to overwhelm medical systems once clusters formed. This combination made it uniquely dangerous. It neither burned out too quickly nor spread so stealthily that it went unnoticed. It occupied the perfect middle ground of viral evolution, a pathogen that moved like a whisper but killed like a storm. Its evolutionary advantages were the product of natural processes, not intentional design. RNA viruses mutate frequently, generating countless variations with each replication cycle. Most mutations are meaningless, some harmful to the virus, but occasionally one enhances survival. SARS-CoV accumulated mutations that sharpened its ability to bind to human receptors, evade early immune detection, and replicate efficiently. These traits, combined with global travel and dense urban environments, gave it unprecedented reach. The virus also revealed how deeply interconnected the human body is. A pathogen that began in the lungs soon affected the heart, liver, and kidneys. The immune system, in attempting to eliminate infection, caused collateral damage throughout the body. Clotting abnormalities emerged, likely driven by systemic inflammation. Patients experienced cascading organ failures as the body struggled to balance defense with survival. Understanding how SARS worked illuminated a sobering truth. Modern medicine, despite its advancements, was still vulnerable to emerging pathogens that exploited the simplest biological weaknesses. Every breath became a potential gateway, every surface a possibility, every interaction a risk. Yet within laboratories, scientists continued unraveling the virus's secrets. They sequenced its genome, identifying the mechanisms that powered its spread. They traced its path through cells, mapped its replication cycle, and studied its mutations. Each discovery brought humanity closer to understanding the enemy it faced, but none erased the magnitude of the crisis unfolding. The mechanics of SARS were not merely scientific details. They were the grammar of a biological narrative that had rewritten global history. They explained why hospitals collapsed, why healthcare workers fell so quickly, why the virus ignited fear with such intensity. They revealed how something so small could destabilize entire nations. SARS was not a phantom. It was a system, an intricate, efficient, merciless system built from the tiniest architecture of life. And as the world grappled with its mechanisms, another reality became clear. Understanding how a virus works does not guarantee the ability to stop it. This realization set the stage for humanity's next chapter, a chapter defined by conflict, controversy, and the desperate struggle to regain control. As SARS tightened its grip around the world, humanity found itself thrust into a kind of war, one without front lines, without generals, without the familiar comforts of strategy or certainty. It was a war fought in hospitals, in homes, in laboratories, and in the minds of millions who woke each morning uncertain of what invisible threats lingered in the breath of a stranger. What followed was a cascade of collapse, conflict, and controversy that revealed not only the virus's deadly efficiency, but the fragile architecture of global response. The collapse began where stress was already greatest: the hospitals. As patient numbers swelled, systems designed for ordinary emergencies buckled beneath the pressure of a crisis none had anticipated. Staff shortages multiplied as workers fell ill or were forced into quarantine. Supplies dwindled. Protective equipment, once taken for granted, became scarce, precious ration. Doctors reused masks intended for single use. Nurses fashioned improvised barriers from whatever materials remained. Medical leaders pleaded for reinforcements that could not arrive fast enough. Entire wards became isolation zones. Ventilators were pushed to their limits. In certain regions, the demand for life-saving equipment overtook the supply, forcing agonizing decisions that left deep moral wounds. The virus exposed a harsh truth: no matter how advanced a nation's healthcare system appeared, it was vulnerable to sudden, concentrated surges that stripped away the illusion of preparedness. Beyond the hospitals, societal structures strained under the weight of fear and uncertainty. Governments wrestled with decisions that carried enormous consequences. Quarantines expanded from individuals to buildings, from buildings to neighborhoods, from neighborhoods to entire cities. Streets that once buzzed with commercial life fell silent. Factories shut down. Transportation networks stalled. Chains of supply fractured. The world accustomed to speed and movement ground to a halt. In this vacuum of certainty, controversy blossomed. Questions mounted about the origins of the virus. Scientists traced genetic sequences seeking clues in the molecular fingerprints of the pathogen. Some pointed toward wildlife markets where animals from diverse ecosystems were brought together, providing fertile ground for viral exchange. Others argued for a more complex chain of transmission that unfolded long before the first market case. As speculation grew, so did geopolitical tension. Accusations crossed borders. Nations demanded transparency from one another, often receiving silence or defensiveness in return. Early communication missteps magnified the crisis. Delays in reporting cases allowed the virus to spread unchallenged in its earliest days. Censorship of warnings, whether through political pressure or fear of public panic, gave SARS the time it needed to escape containment. These decisions, rooted in uncertainty, fear, or political calculation, would become central controversies that historians would examine for decades. As the virus spread, the world turned to the World Health Organization for guidance. But even global institutions found themselves pulled between scientific caution and political constraints. Travel warnings sparked diplomatic disputes. Border closures ignited accusations of discrimination. Some governments accused the WHO of acting too slowly. Others claimed the organization acted too aggressively. Scientific advice became entangled with political agendas, obscuring the clarity needed in such a moment. Conspiracy theories surged in the vacuum left by incomplete information. Speculation about engineered viruses, secret experiments, and hidden agendas cascaded across continents. Fear gave these theories momentum. Uncertainty allowed them to thrive. For many, the truth felt too small, too mundane, too rooted in natural processes to explain the scale of unfolding catastrophe. A microscopic spillover event seemed insufficient to justify the global chaos, and so alternative narratives took root, narratives that deepened mistrust between citizens and institutions already strained by crisis. Even within the scientific community, conflict erupted. Researchers raced to publish findings, sometimes without full verification, driven by urgency and pressure. Competing theories challenged one another. Disagreements emerged over treatments, case definitions, modes of transmission. What one laboratory declared possible, another refuted. The public, witnessing these scientific debates in real time, struggled to understand how experts could disagree so fundamentally and how truth could seem so fluid in a moment when clarity was desperately needed. Yet amid the turmoil, instances of global cooperation also emerged. Scientists shared viral sequences across borders within days. Laboratories exchanged data with unprecedented speed. Teams collaborated across time zones to unravel the mechanisms of the pathogen. Nations sent medical teams to assist overwhelmed regions. International aid groups mobilized resources and expertise. These efforts represented humanity at its most resilient, an affirmation that even amid political strife, collective action remained possible. Still, the virus pushed back at every turn. Quarantine slowed transmission but could not extinguish it completely. Transmission chains reappeared in places believed to be safe. Superspreading events ignited sudden bursts of infection that defied predictions. The enemy was too small, too adaptable, too deeply embedded within the fabric of human behavior to be halted by any single action. Economic collapse deepened the crisis's impact. Entire industries crumbled: airlines, hospitality, tourism, sending shockwaves through global markets. Governments scrambled to stabilize financial systems already staggering under the weight of uncertainty. For many citizens, the fear of infection intertwined with the fear of unemployment, food insecurity, and mounting debt. The virus exposed socioeconomic inequalities that had long been ignored, revealing how unevenly the burdens of crisis were shouldered. Social unrest simmered under the strain. Protests erupted in some regions driven by desperation or mistrust. People questioned the fairness of quarantine measures, the adequacy of government support, the reliability of official information. Meanwhile, others demanded stricter enforcement, desperate for safety. This tension fractured communities at a moment when unity was most needed. As the crisis peaked, a turning point slowly emerged. The world began to adapt. Quarantines reduced transmission in key regions. Contact tracing became more organized. Isolation procedures improved as knowledge deepened. Hospitals expanded capacity. New protocols protected healthcare workers more effectively. Slowly, gradually, the relentless upward curve began to bend. But victory was not declared with celebration or triumph. It came quietly, cautiously, with the knowledge that a single overlooked case could reignite catastrophe. The battle against SARS did not end in dramatic fashion. It faded in slow increments through relentless effort and profound sacrifice. The controversies remained. The scars remained. The lessons, hard-earned, tragic, unforgettable, etched themselves into the consciousness of a world forced to confront its own fragility. As SARS retreated, humanity faced a final and haunting truth. The outbreak could have been far worse. The world had not conquered the virus, it had merely survived it. And even as governments declared the crisis contained a silent warning, lingered one that would echo into the decades that followed. When the final embers of the SARS outbreak dimmed, the world exhaled with a relief that felt almost hollow. The virus had retreated, but the scars it carved into global consciousness remained vivid. In its wake, SARS left a legacy that reshaped medicine governance and the fragile psychology of an interconnected world. It was a legacy written not only in numbers and reports, but in the lingering unease that settled over nations long after the outbreak had ended. The first legacy lay within the walls of global epidemiology. The quiet discipline that once operated in the background of international health was thrust into the spotlight. Researchers had witnessed firsthand how swiftly a pathogen could slip through continents, how misinformation could derail response efforts, and how critical early detection was in preventing catastrophe. The world that emerged after SARS understood with new clarity that surveillance could no longer be reactive, it needed to be anticipatory. As a result, international networks expanded. Laboratories coordinated across borders. Databases grew more sophisticated, capable of tracking genetic sequences, transmission patterns, and emerging threats in real time. Outbreak intelligence, once a niche field, became an essential pillar of global security. Countries invested in rapid response teams, strengthened disease reporting requirements, and rehearsed scenarios once dismissed as improbable. The memory of SARS pulsed beneath every new system, reminding authorities how costly hesitation could be. Yet the legacy extended far beyond institutions. It seeped into the everyday rhythms of urban life. Cities that once celebrated density and movement began to reconsider their vulnerabilities. The virus had demonstrated how quickly infection could spread through crowded buildings, mass transit, and unventilated spaces. Architects, planners, and public health officials began reimagining the anatomy of cities, ventilation standards, hospital readiness, emergency plans, public sanitation infrastructures. SARS had revealed the contours of invisible danger woven through modernity, forcing humanity to rethink the very spaces it inhabited. For survivors and families, the legacy carried emotional weight that statistics could never capture. The trauma of sudden isolation, the grief of losing loved ones behind sealed doors, and the lingering fear of respiratory illness etched lasting imprints. Healthcare workers bore their own burdened memories of relentless exhaustion, of colleagues who fell ill, of battles fought behind heavy protective gear. Many carried these memories into future outbreaks, shaping their responses with a mixture of caution, resilience, and dread. Economically, SARS left deep imprints in markets that once seemed untouchable. The crisis revealed how fragile global commerce could be when disrupted by disease. Tourism collapsed. Airlines approached bankruptcy. Manufacturing chains fractured. Losses rippled through sectors dependent on mobility and proximity. Governments learned that economic resilience required planning not only for natural disasters or political upheaval, but for biological threats capable of halting entire industries overnight. In this sense, SARS served as a fiscal warning, a glimpse into vulnerabilities that would later echo during even greater pandemics. But perhaps the most profound legacy lay within science itself. SARS accelerated research into coronaviruses, pushing virologists to investigate a family of pathogens previously considered peripheral. Laboratories built new models, created new tools, and mapped coronavirus genomes with unprecedented precision. They studied spike proteins, replication cycles, and transmission patterns, slowly assembling a knowledge base that would become critical in decades to come. The virus that once confounded researchers ultimately became a gateway to understanding a broader viral universe. This scientific awakening sparked deeper questions about humanity's relationship with the natural world. The spillover that triggered SARS did not occur in isolation, it was part of an escalating pattern. As human populations expanded into forests, as wildlife trade intensified, as ecological balance faltered, the frequency of zoonotic threats increased. SARS forced the world to acknowledge that pandemics were not random tragedies, but predictable outcomes of ecological disruption. It highlighted the delicate thread connecting human survival to environmental stewardship. These warnings echoed into subsequent years, reverberating through the emergence of MERS in 2012, a virus from the same coronavirus lineage carried by camels capable of causing even higher mortality. The similarities were undeniable. The threat was unmistakable. SARS had not been an isolated aberration, it was a precursor, another warning, another reminder, another demonstration of how easily a microscopic agent could reshape civilization. Yet even these lessons, though powerful, were not enough to shield the world from the future. When COVID-19 emerged in 2019, the shadows of SARS resurfaced with chilling clarity. The world recognized the pattern, the rapid spread, the respiratory collapse, the superspreading events, the importance of early transparency. Everything SARS had revealed its warnings, its scars, its lessons re-emerged in amplified form. But the difference lay in scale. COVID-19 spread further, faster, deeper. It exploited the same vulnerabilities SARS had exposed, but with greater ferocity. And so SARS became a ghost woven into the narrative of every modern outbreak. It became the template that shaped pandemic playbooks, the reference point for global response, the early alarm that sounded before a louder one would shake the world. Even as years passed, scientists revisited the genome of SARS-CoV, studying its mutations, comparing it to new variants, searching for answers within its molecular architecture. Beyond science and policy, SARS altered public perception. It reminded humanity that progress does not guarantee protection, that advanced technology does not erase vulnerability, and that the smallest organisms can challenge the most powerful nations. It instilled a lingering skepticism about safety, a quiet awareness that the next outbreak could emerge without warning from a place no one expected, carried by a host no one noticed. Culturally, SARS reshaped behaviors that once seemed immutable. Mask wearing, once rare outside medical settings, became normalized in parts of Asia. Public health campaigns proliferated, teaching hand hygiene, respiratory etiquette, and disease awareness. Schools incorporated outbreak preparedness into curricula. The virus had rebuilt social awareness from the ground up, embedding new rituals into daily life. Yet the world also revealed a familiar human tendency to forget. As years passed without major outbreaks, vigilance softened. Surveillance systems weakened. Political priorities shifted. Budgets tightened. The memory of fear faded, replaced by the comfort of normalcy. SARS remained in scientific literature and policy recommendations in the minds of specialists, but for much of the world it became a footnote. Still, some understood the deeper truth. SARS was not merely a historical event, it was a rehearsal, a demonstration of how fragile civilization could become when confronted with forces it could not fully control. It was a message delivered through devastation, urging humanity to prepare to understand, to respect the boundaries it had crossed, and the consequences of ignoring nature's quiet warnings. The virus that once seemed like an anomaly had in truth foreshadowed the future. It taught the world that pandemics were not relics of the past, but inevitabilities of the present. It revealed that respiratory pathogens could shut down cities, cripple economies, and fracture societies with alarming ease, and it showed that even when a virus is contained, the vulnerabilities it exposes remain. SARS's modern legacy is thus a paradox, both a triumph of containment and a stark reminder of how close the world came to disaster. It left behind knowledge, tools, and systems that would later prove indispensable. But it also left behind a warning that survival does not equal immunity and that forgetting is the most dangerous response of all. For in the pattern of history, every warning unheeded sets the stage for a greater reckoning. And SARS was nothing if not a message written not in words but in cells, lungs, borders, and memories. In the quiet aftermath of the SARS outbreak, when the final reports were written and the last isolation wards were dismantled, a deeper silence settled over the world. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, heavy, reflective, tinged with the knowledge that destruction had passed close enough to be felt, but not close enough to be fully understood. In that silence, humanity found itself confronting questions far older than the virus itself. Questions about vulnerability, memory, and the fragile architecture of civilization. SARS had not destroyed societies, but it had shown how easily they could fracture. It revealed how quickly confidence could crumble when breath itself became a threat. It reminded humanity that the invisible world so often ignored shapes the visible one with ruthless precision. The virus needed no weapons, no armies, no political strategy. It needed only the simplest act of life, the movement of air from one pair of lungs to another. And so in the aftermath, the world struggled to reconcile the scale of fear with the relative brevity of the outbreak. The virus receded, but the questions it raised lingered like smoke. How could something so small disrupt so much? How could nations so powerful feel so helpless? And how could a single moment of ecological disturbance, an encounter between species separated for millennia, ignite consequences felt across continents? These questions forced humanity to look inward. SARS was a reminder that progress does not erase ancient weaknesses, it merely masks them behind layers of technology and confidence. Beneath those layers, humans remained biological beings bound to the same delicate systems that governed their ancestors. The lungs, the breath, the immune response, these were ancient mechanisms unchanged by modern ambition. And SARS found its way into these mechanisms with ease. The outbreak also revealed a paradox at the heart of human civilization. The same interconnectedness that enriches life also exposes it. Modern cities, global travel, dense networks of trade and movement. These inventions magnified the reach of a virus that could otherwise have faded unnoticed. SARS exploited everything humanity had built, turning connection into vulnerability and mobility into risk. Yet beneath the despair lay another truth, one more nuanced, more human. The crisis illuminated acts of courage that unfolded quietly amid the chaos. Healthcare workers who labored through exhaustion, scientists who worked through the night to decode the virus's secrets, families who endured separation to protect one another, communities that adapted to uncertainty with patience and resolve. These moments, though overshadowed by fear, reflected humanity's capacity to respond not with surrender, but with resilience. And still, the deepest lesson SARS offered was philosophical rather than scientific. It taught the world that certainty is an illusion, that control is temporary, that life depends on forces that operate far beyond human perception. It reminded humanity of the fragile equilibrium that allows civilization to function a balance easily disturbed by a microscopic shift in nature's vast, intricate design. The outbreak became a marker dividing time into before and after. Before, SARS pandemics felt like relics of history, distant shadows from eras defined by limited medicine and limited knowledge. After SARS, the world understood that such threats had never vanished. They had merely waited for the right conditions to return. The idea that modernity could shield humanity from biological catastrophe was shattered, replaced by a cold comprehension of what truly lies at stake in an interconnected world. In this final reflection, one truth rises above the rest. SARS was not the end of anything, it was the beginning. A warning whispered through collapsing lungs and silent rooms. A glimpse into the future delivered through suffering. A message from nature reminding humanity of its place within a living, unpredictable world. For years after the outbreak, researchers revisited SARS with a sense of unfinished business. They traced its genetic lineage, studied its mutations, and mapped its spread with forensic precision. Each discovery reinforced the same conclusion that the virus was not an anomaly, but part of a broader pattern. A pattern shaped by ecological disruption, global travel, dense populations, and the relentless pressure of evolution. When new coronaviruses emerged first, MERS, then COVID-19, the echoes of SARS reverberated with striking clarity. The fears felt in 2003 resurfaced. The struggles returned. The systems tested by SARS were pushed again, this time, harder, further, deeper. The warnings that SARS had offered were revealed not as historical footnotes, but as premonitions. In the end, the legacy of SARS is not defined by numbers or dates. It is defined by the shadow it cast across time. A shadow that stretched beyond its own outbreak, reaching into the decades that followed, shaping how the world would confront threats yet unknown. And as humanity continues moving through a world shaped by viruses, by rapid change, and by the delicate balance of shared breath, the memory of SARS lingers like a distant, haunting echo. A reminder that the smallest of enemies can expose the greatest of vulnerabilities. A reminder that warnings come not with thunder, but with whispers. A reminder that the next crisis waits in silence, watching, preparing, unfolding in places unseen. And a reminder above all that the world rarely heeds the lesson until the warning becomes impossible to ignore.